It's absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We are now on our third segment of the day here, and we're going to take a little respite from the world of the NFL for a little bit and talk about the world of college football as always. We talk about NFL fantasy stars. We can't forget about our college football ones as well. For any fantasy college football players out there watching today, it should be a good one here because we have a lot of interesting performances from this past weekend to discuss, and overall a lot of breakout performances as well. Without further ado, let's talk about them. At the quarterback position, this is a guy who I feel like finally found a formula that works for him in a very important game for this Notre Dame team. Because we always think about Riley Leonard as someone who is an effective runner of the football, but his dual threat abilities really suffer when it comes to the passing game. He's not as effective as a passer as we would want out of a dual threat QB, and we've seen it throughout the season. We've seen him put together very solid rushing performances, but haven't necessarily seen him pass the football as effectively as you would like for someone of his caliber and for someone playing at that kind of program. But against Navy at MetLife, it all came together. 13 of 21, 178 yards, 2 touchdowns to the air. Still had 10 carries for 83 yards and 1 touchdown on the ground for a total of 29.4 fantasy points. But this proved that Riley Leonard's going to be a scary guy should Notre Dame get into the CFP. And they're still very much in the discussion. Remember, as an independent, it might be tougher for them to truly prove to the committee without being in a conference their strengths. And so they needed this win against a ranked Navy side who, for all intents and purposes, was looking like they could have upset Notre Dame with their style of play, but ultimately came up very disgustingly short. Navy could not necessarily get anything going. And so Notre Dame rolls on, and if you want to see Riley Leonard succeed, this was the performance that showed that he can succeed in both manners, through the air and through the ground. And it's a very important one because they face another military academy looking to knock them down a peg, an Army. So this performance is truly paramount to the success of Riley Leonard and this Notre Dame team as well. So congratulations to Riley Leonard for making this list for the first time. The running back position, this is a guy who's going to turn a lot of heads in the playoff race, especially in the ACC that's getting just that much more congested as weeks go on. How about Bashard Smith of the SMU Mustangs? 26 carries, 177 yards, 2 touchdowns, 27.4 fantasy points. The week before a big game against Pitt that proves what those schools will be an ACC contender. And not for nothing, I feel like SMU is one of those teams who relies on the explosiveness they have on the offensive side of the football. They're going to win games by beating you, by scoring as many points as possible before you can even blink your eye. And so Rashard Smith being a part of this offensive unit is highly integral to their standings in both the ACC and CFP races, because if one offensive weapon for SMU is off, then who knows how this team will translate in tougher games on the stretch. Because not for nothing, Pitt's looked very efficient and their defense is very scary. So I feel like if SMU does not look prepared for that game, then they're challenging. But for the time being, I feel like SMU is going to be a team ready for anything here in the ACC down the stretch. But it's going to be dependent on guys like Rashard Smith to step up. Because as much as I love Kevin Jennings, there might be a time where his dual threat abilities get exposed, and Pitt could be that team. So you need that balance on your offense if you're SMU. But for the time being, Rashard Smith is definitely deserving of a place on my list. At the wide receiver position, it's a little bit tough to kind of parse through these wide receiver performances. No one really stood out. But I feel like this guy who's making his second appearance on my list actually is one of those guys who you wouldn't have expected starting the year to really have as much of an impact as people think. But as someone who's been all too familiar with him this season and all too familiar to what he brings to the plate for Texas as a Texas Longhorns fan, I really think we're starting to see the growth maturity of this young man in DeAndre Moore. I feel like as one of the younger players in that wide receiver core, he is going to be someone who for many years here at the program would be someone who potentially has so much more room for growth because of the fact no one really expected him to break out this early in his career here. But this game, a very rough game for Texas where they needed every bit of their offensive production. 5 receptions, 97 yards, 2 touchdowns for a total of 24.7 fantasy points for DeAndre Moore. This goes to show that if Texas are in games from the stretch, especially in this very tough stretch after their bye where they're facing Florida, Arkansas, and Kentucky, teams very capable of knocking them down a peg. And then in their final game of the season, going on the road to Kyle Field to face a very, very physical Texas A&M team who's looking to potentially eliminate them from CFP contention. You're going to need versatility in your offense. That's the name of the game for Texas, and that's what their credo is that they live by. So look for DeAndre Moore to potentially, as the season goes on, get more and more looks at the wide receiver position. Most importantly, have that translate over into many more years in the Arch Manning era of success for him and this team. Because I feel like this season for Texas has proved to be a wake-up call a little bit in their first 2 real big SEC tests. At home to Georgia, they got knocked down a peg. On the road to Vanderbilt, who's now becoming a very tough team to play against at home, and not necessarily a pushover anymore here in the SEC. I feel like Texas is starting to realize what it needs to truly compete year in, year out in the SEC. And DeAndre Moore could be an X factor to their success in this conference for many years. And now, just 2 guys who I wanted to mention, not necessarily because of the fact that I would choose them over any of the other 3 guys I've picked, because it was very difficult in terms of trying to pick so many different people at so many different positions because of the fact that there were not that many good performances by certain positions. But these are 2 guys who, on national title contending teams, could prove to be vital and integral to their team's success. One being a running back who people can't oft forget about in this Miami offense, and a Penn State quarterback potentially is going to have to play in the biggest game of the year next week for them, but truly showed what he could look like in that one and showing how serviceable he can be for the Nittany Lions. And witnessing him firsthand on the campus of Penn State really shows me how electrifying this kid can be. So without further ado, let's talk about Damian Martinez and then discuss Bo Pribula. Let's talk about Damian Martinez. First, 15 carries, 148 yards, 2 touchdowns, 29.4 fantasy points to completely take over the state of Florida. Miami has now beaten all the Florida teams this season, and this one wasn't necessarily, about, compiling a lofty number of yards for Cam Ward as we've seen in the past for him. It was about Damian Martinez. And let's not forget how good Damian Martinez is. An Oregon State transfer comes into Miami looking for a fresh start, really boosting this team as well, because not only do you have to account for the effectiveness of Cam Ward and one of the better receiving corps in the nation, now you have to account for a very physical, explosive back in Damian Martinez. And he proved that if you can't handle the entirety of the Miami offense, he's going to be the knockout punch week in, week out. If there are any games coming up where Cam Ward has a slow start, is not as effective as you would like him to be, or your receiver core is a little bit unsettled, then look for Damian Martinez to really be a breakthrough star down the stretch for Miami. And then Bo Pribula stepping in for an injured Drew Aller after halftime in that game against Wisconsin. Very big win. I was actually at the Penn State campus, had the pleasure of being around an atmosphere that, even though they weren't playing at home, was really, truly electrifying. Nothing can beat a college campus on game day, especially the number 3 team in the nations. And so Bo Prabula in a tough spot, on the road in a highly integral game before the big one against Ohio State at home. 11 of 13, 98 yards, 1 touchdown, 10.7 fantasy points. A highly effective kind of spot start for him. Not necessarily a real start for him, but still an effective one there. And should he be, the starter, have to replace Drew Aller for this game against Ohio State, look for him to still remain effective. I feel like, I don't want to get ahead of myself talking about this game, but seeing the hype around that campus, expect Beaver Stadium to be very packed that weekend. Expect, no matter what happens in this one, for Penn State to stick with this team. It truly is an incredible atmosphere that Penn State is building, and they are truly a sneaky contender here. They don't necessarily win pretty, but they get the job done, and they do it well. And so I just wanted to acknowledge Bo Prabula, as someone who hasn't necessarily gotten the plaudits he received from a 5-star recruit coming in to Penn State, having to sit behind Aller for at least this year and stepping in as well as he did in that tough situation when they were even down and leading them to this comeback victory. Kudos to him. Kudos to the entire campus of Penn State. That was truly electrifying. If you ever get the chance to go there, go. It's a great atmosphere. But that is my list. Definitely a couple players who, might have been out of the ordinary. Maybe not necessarily players you hear too much about, but that's the beauty of this list. I want to get people more known, get players more known that can help you in your fantasy college football exploits. Without further ado, we're going to take a quick break, and on the other side, we're going to begin our positional rankings for Week 9 of the NFL season, talking about some fantasy QBs who could warrant a start for you this coming week. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to talk about them after this short break.